Yeah, I think we're going to get started. I wore the wrong glasses. I can either see you or I can see my notes, so I'm going to go with the notes. Thank you all for coming this evening. This is Sharpsburg Stories, and this is the first in what I hope will be a series of this kind of thing. I'm trying to take this to different neighborhoods. After tonight, I wish I could come back to this neighborhood all the time, I'm sure. But really, the intention is to do this kind of thing and to get to know lots of different neighborhoods and get people going to other neighborhoods and bringing people who have always lived in the neighborhood, like many of you tonight, and people who just love coming here and people who came here lately. So that's the hopes for this project. If you know of another neighborhood or another community, and by community I mean community of teachers, community of healthcare, any kind of a neighborhood that would like to have this kind of program, please talk to me at halftime. At halftime we have drinks and snacks, and we have a number of people here that you can also talk to at the break in between. We'll have 4 speakers and then a break and then 4 more. On hand tonight is Marcia Pugliese Rosado. Where are you, Marcia? And she's going to talk a little bit about her book, which is just a kind of a love letter to this neighborhood with recipes. So be sure that you talk to her at halftime. Cameron Smith is here. He's the historian with the Cooper Siegel Library, and he is already doing a project where he collects neighborhood stories. You don't even have to stand in front of a mic to do his thing. It's Cameron, you come up here and tell them what it is. Cameron Smith.
Please, that's not necessary. Sorry, it's a short microphone. Okay. So my name is Cameron Smith. I'm a local history librarian. That's at Cooper Siegel, which is up on the hill there. And we're doing something, it's called our community stories. So it's very much in line with what's happening here, and we're preserving kind of just local stories. I mean, these are things that people have done or do in the area. It's the Fox Chapel area. I've had a Vietnam veteran come in and talk about his military experience. Then he went back as an educator, and he talked about that. He lives right near 28. And then I've also talked about my favorite restaurant is in Fox Chapel. Shout out Jimmy Wan's. And I've been going there for like 15 years. It's absurd. So it's the whole breadth. My tagline is what? The things that they won't write about in history books. And that doesn't mean that they're not important. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody. Thank you. I have business cards, okay?
Yeah, so some of our speakers that we have today I found through Cameron's archive of stories, and so it's really worth going there and listening to the stories, even if you don't feel you have one to contribute. What else? Oh, Franco Ferrara is here today. His documentary Il Messaggero is all about Sharpsburg. If you've never seen it, he's here today. Stand up so they can, and again, go and talk to him about his project. We're very happy to have him. Sorry.
That's all right. He works for network television in Baltimore and is was a resident of Sharpsburg, but I was the production assistant for that.
Thank you for clarifying. It's amazing. Like I didn't grow up here, so I had to come into the community and find people for this. And now that I have it all together, I'm still meeting more people who are adding to this evening. So thank you. Let's see. Oh, of course, I want to thank some of the people who have helped make this evening possible. I want to thank the Sharpsburg Historical Commission that gave us funding for tonight, and also Nancy Goldberg of Ketchup City and her group Artspiration, also for very nice and generous funding. It does take a little money to put something like this together, and it's very much appreciated. It's a great community support, and I thank both groups. I want to thank Onyx and Emma of Atithi Gallery. They've been extremely helpful in setting everything up, and all the way around. And for Corey Ochai, who's going to speak tonight, but also is doing the video and making this thing work and all that. So also a hand for Corey. And of course, I appreciate all the people who are going to come up to this mic tonight. Most of our speakers have been in front of a classroom, a courtroom, in a campfire, borough council, but they haven't all been in this situation where they're going to stand up and tell a story in front of a mic. So we asked you to, warmly welcome everyone, let them know how much you enjoy their stories. We have Chris, Albert, Allison, Claire, Bob, Kayla and Chaz, Emma and Corey, and Marcia, who very generously agreed to stand in because Roman couldn't be here tonight. He's got tonsillitis. Who is the youngest speaker that we had, and now he's sick. But, we're sorry to miss him tonight. I myself was born and raised on the north side, on the slopes of the East Street Valley. My first memories of Sharpsburg had nothing to do with Rust Belt industries or family life in a small community or a place with a bar on every corner and just as many churches. These are all things I've heard about in reference to Sharpsburg. As a child, this place, Sharpsburg, was the deep woods because the only thing I knew about was Gaiasuta. And that's my dad and brothers camped here. My sister and I and my mom, we stayed at home, and I think she burned candles in front of the Virgin Mary so wild animals wouldn't get the guys, she worried. I don't know how we got here to Gaiasuta, but it was the woods to me. And years later, I camped here with my son when he was a Cub Scout. Albert and I came here for hikes. We still come for hikes with friends. It's a beautiful part of this place. So our first speaker tonight will be talking about a lover of the woods and a champion of the environment who influenced generations of kids in Sharpsburg and beyond. First up to the mic tonight will be Chris Charney. Chris grew up on Parkview with her brother and sister, the Vecchio family. She went to elementary school right here at Madonna in Sharpsburg, grades K to 8. She was a teacher in the Fox Chapel School District for 35 years, a teacher and a naturalist at the Audubon Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve for 2 years, and she's currently a volunteer docent at Phipps Conservatory. Chris is going to launch our evening with a story of one of the area's most influential environmentalist, Beulah Fry. So welcome to the mic, Chris Charney.
Thank you, Joanne. I have the distinct pleasure of being the first one, so I can get things done and then enjoy everybody else's. So thank you for that, Joanne. As Joanne said, I actually grew up on Parkview, so I see a lot of familiar Parkview faces here today. And I went to elementary school here in Sharpsburg for 9 years at Madonna of Jerusalem. When I graduated from 8th grade, I convinced my parents to let me go to public school. And that was in the year 1962 when Fox Chapel merged many of the municipalities. And so since I was from O'Hara, then I went to Fox Chapel High School. Sharpsburg was not yet a part of that merger at that point. So when I was in 10th grade, I had the honor of having Miss Beulah Fry as my biology teacher. And Beulah was trying a new method of teaching that was a little experimental, where you allowed the students to have a more hands-on approach. And so she made biology just a lot more interesting. And one of the things that I remember about her classes was she would really try to get us involved. And when it would come around to February, March, she asked us to every day try to bring in some observation of some sign of spring. So we would come in and say, oh, I saw a robin or I saw a dandelion, and then she'd write it on the board, and you had to come in with new things. So someone saw a red-winged blackbird, and I thought, never heard of that, but one day I was out and I saw this blackbird with a red wing on its patch, and I guess that's a red-winged blackbird. And so that kind of got my feet a little bit into the whole issue of nature and the environment and really appreciating things like that. So I kind of lost touch with Beulah after 10th grade and didn't really have much contact with her. And then in 1970, I got my first teaching job with the Fox Chapel School District, and that was the year that Sharpsburg was incorporated into the Fox Chapel School District. So my first 3 years of teaching were here in Sharpsburg. My first year, I was down at the middle school building, which used to be Sharpsburg High School, but it was then Sharpsburg Elementary. And it was in a very traditional classroom. And my second year, we had a new principal, and we were going into this concept of open classroom, where we kind of tore down the walls, and kids had all kinds of different interests, and it wasn't, you know, sit in your desk and follow along with the lesson, but it was a more hands-on approach, somewhat like Beulah did. And so I was in the old chem lab when it was the high school, so I was moved from a traditional classroom to this wonderful, beautiful space with a sink and just lots of fun for the kids. And then the third year, I moved across the street to the Linden Avenue School, where they closed the Middle Street School. And so it became the Linden Avenue. This school was truly designed for the open classroom. It was remodeled so that there was all this space, and the kids moved freely within that space. And that was the same year that Beulah Fry became the environmental educator for the Fox Chapel School District. So Pennsylvania passed a law that all school districts had to have an environmental educator. And what most school districts did, they just said, well, you're the science teacher, you're the environmental ed teacher, and nothing really changed. They just had a little bit of extra work to do, but you know, how much could they do? But Beulah had the foresight to convince the district to allow her to have this as a full-time administrative position, where she coordinated all of the environmental education for the district. Now, what that meant was she kind of took all of us teachers under her wing and mentored us and showed us how we could use the environment in our teaching. It wasn't a separate class. It was every subject you tied into environmental education. For example, she took us teachers out into the environment. She would go to every elementary school in the district, and in Sharpsburg, she would take us out and we'd walk the streets, and she'd show us, oh, you know, here's a plant coming up in the crack of the sidewalk, and you know, she would take us up to High Street, right at the bottom of Rabine Street, and point out the flowers and the wildflowers and the weeds, we would call them, growing up there. You know, for example, there's a plant up there called coltsfoot that gets a little yellow flower in the spring. Everybody thinks it's a dandelion, but its leaf is shaped like a colt's foot, and that's how it gets its name. And she taught us that the pioneers in the early days were not able to get salt, so they would burn the colt's foot and use the ashes as a salt substitute. So it was like little things like that that she would really kind of make it real for us and make it interesting and fun. And one of the greatest resources we had in Sharpsburg was the Allegheny River, and we could walk to it. We could take our classes down there. We could do a math lesson. Well, I remember taking a group of students down there, and we would put an orange in the river. And we would set a timer, show them how to use a stopwatch. That's math. We would measure a distance with yardsticks and time how long it took the orange to get from one section to the other. And those were the kind of things that she encouraged us to do and mentored us on. You know, we would look at animal tracks and make plaster casts of the animal tracks down by the river. So it was really a great thing. And in our walks, when she would take us around to the various parts of Sharpsburg, she was always so impressed that the people of Sharpsburg cared so much about their property. She said their yards are not always very big, but every inch of them has flowers or vegetables, and she just really appreciated the pride that the people in Sharpsburg had for their environment, and she tried to foster that in us teachers and get us to foster it with our students as well. So as she worked in the, within the school district, she established a field trip for every elementary grade. So in addition to your regular field trips like to the zoo or the museum or Hines or wherever people would go on their field trips back then, every year the students would go to Beechwood Farms, Trillium Trail, Salamander Park, and there was a set field trip. So this was something that teachers didn't have to worry about getting buses. She took care of all of that, took care of all the funding and everything for it. And then one of the things was the environmental program, the resident camp, where the 5th graders went up to Camp Lutherland for a full week and lived there. And Albert's going to talk a little bit about that later. So you'll get to hear more about Camp Lutherland and Miss Fry. But basically, she just really kind of instilled in us teachers and how we had to take Rachel Carson's concept of a sense of wonder, and that was the most important thing that you could give the students. And an example of that is she would have these camps in the summer where students could come to Guyasuta or up to the community park in O'Hara Township, and we would do activities with them. I would be working with her then, and she would be coordinating it, and students would come up to her and say, "Oh, Miss Fry, I saw a robin." And it was like, okay, that's the 10th robin we saw in the last 5 minutes, but Miss Fry would, "Oh, you saw a robin, that's wonderful." And she would get them to elicit, responses. "Oh, what was it doing? Where did you see it?" And so she really made every student feel very important, and that what their observations were really important. And so I hope that I was able to give that same sense of wonder back to my students when I was teaching. And I would just like to close today with a passage. I have these old yearbooks. Someone I know loves to go to libraries and rescue books that are getting thrown away, and he found these yearbooks that someone was throwing away, and I said, "Oh, let's see if Miss Fry is any of them." So she was first a teacher at Aspinwall High School when she started out. And so this Cavalier is the yearbook from Aspinwall High School. And there's a dedication to her. Here's her picture. And here's also a picture down below with her students on a field trip. And I have these yearbooks that you can look at during the break. Feel free to take a look at them. But I just want to read to you the dedication. The students said, "We, the seniors of Aspinwall High School, gratefully dedicate this 1960 Cavalier to our biology teacher, Miss Fry. From dissecting in bug class to bird watching in the early morning to spending fun-packed and educational weekends at the Nature Den, she has tried to open our eyes, ears, and minds to nature's wonders. It is in appreciation of her devoted teaching and inspirational guidance, especially in those extracurricular activities, that we proudly dedicate this yearbook to her." Okay.
Thank you, Chris. And thanks to that mysterious gentleman who found the yearbooks. I think that was a great start. First of all, brave to be the first person, but it speaks to this issue of legacy, which Beulah obviously passed on to her students, and which Chris passed on to hers. That's what storytelling is about too. So we have another storyteller coming up, and up next is Albert Pantone. I didn't do that. Albert is a fiber artist. He creates art and teaches paper making with invasive weeds at his business, Not Just Weeds, in Braddock, PA. Albert's a retired recreation therapist from the John Cain Community Living Center at Glen Hazel. And prior to that, and starting early on, he worked as a camp counselor, then program director, and eventually camp director in a variety of settings, sharing the outdoors and organized camping with many different populations for most of his adult life. I think he's an adult now. From an early age, Albert loved nature, wild animals, crafts, and being out of doors. He's very comfortable in the forest setting or the jungle. As a freshwater Pisces, Albert enjoys exploring and canoeing rivers, lakes, and streams. He depends on his vivid imagination daily. Now, with a great Sharpsburg story, When the Streetlights Come On, Sharpsburg native Albert Pantone.
In Sharpsburg. Hey everybody, seeing all these faces I know. I probably have stories about all you guys, but not tonight. Not tonight. I grew up on Penn and 13th Street, right over there, and it was right by the hill. And we had a big family. There were 9 of us. My mom and my dad, and I had 2 older sisters and 4 younger brothers. And the walls were beige or flowered wallpaper, and the carpet was green, and the house was noisy. And I just knew at an early age I needed to get moving. I needed to be out. So I remember being very young. I remember sitting at the register vent on the floor one winter and thinking that was a campfire in the jungle. And I was roasting my mother's wax fruit on the hot register vent. Well, because crayons fell right through. So I was roasting her wax fruit and just thinking about being out of doors and camping. And my mom had her hands full having 7 kids, and she had some major fears. She feared electricity, fire, and open water. So when we were young, my brother and my dad took us down to 19th Street to see the river for the first time. And I must have been 6. And I was so amazed. We were walking down there, and you hear the roar of the dam, and you saw the weeds were higher than me. It was like tan-colored mud, and the river was like a blue-green, and it smelled of rust and fish down there. And it was just a great place to be. So we're walking, and I saw an old man fishing. So I sort of walked away from them, and this man had rods and a stringer, and the fish were flopping on this stringer, and he had a can filled with worms. And I was just so amazed by this. I sat down in the dirt, and I just started looking at these worms, and I don't recall how long I was sitting there, but I heard a little high pitch, like a, and I looked, and here comes my dad running. He scooped me up, beat my ass twice, hugged me really hard, and there were tears in his eyes. And I'm like, I was confused why he would be that way. I had no idea that he probably thought I was floating down to the north side. But the river was just an amazing place for me. Back then, I guess my story pretty much revolves around 62 to 66. And Halloween time was great back then. After trick-or-treating, there was always a parade. And people would go in their costumes, and they'd walk down towards the fire station, which was next to the Circle K. It was that fire station. And the firemen would have these bags full of candy, and every kid had a bag. And I was so excited because in that bag was filled with candy. But also I was so excited because there was also a popcorn ball. And yet I love those popcorn balls, but I was really excited because they were wrapped in colored cellophane. And I would get that cellophane. There was blues and golds and reds and greens. And I'd walk around the rest of the night like this. By the end of the night, I had a color for each eye. It just sort of says a lot about me. But my first dose of actual freedom was I was allowed to walk to Frank's store. We had Frank's over here. And Frank's was right next to the Presbyterian Church, which is the center right now. And it was a great store. It was only a block and a half from my house. I went for milk and Town Talk bread, and my mother would always say, run there and walk back. And Frank's had everything. There was fruit, vegetables, a deli counter, cleaning supplies, canned goods, but I wasn't interested in any of that because Frank's was the go-to place for candy. And they had candy and big green bottles of Tom Tucker mint ginger ale and wax lips, kites, these balsam wood airplanes with a rubber band engine, and they should have those today for short flights. I really think that would be a great idea. And also, I'm sorry, so much to talk about. And also cream of soda and Hostess banana flips. That's too intense for some folks, I'm told. And I was always wondering why his candy counter was right next to the big counter. And so he always kept their eyes on kids and his candy. But if you walk down there today, where it was, I bet you could find some black sludgy spots on the ground, and that's from the wax of that nasty juice that used to come in those little wax bottles. This is some archaeology here. There's steel stains on there for that. And that was a great freedom of me to be able to do that on my own. So like I said, our house was pretty crowded and noisy. So sooner or later, my mom had to let me out of the house more because I explored every square inch of the backyard. So she set up some perimeters for me. And I could go as far as 16th Street, and I can go as far as the Madonna Church. I couldn't go up the hill where they were building 28, and I couldn't go down to that damn river to drown just to spite my mother. So, Mama, that's where the fun is, and I went to all those places. So, back then, there was a schedule of when they would be blasting for 28. So I remember looking out the second story window and knowing when I'm going to see an explosion. And sure enough, they would explode. You'd see the dust and you'd hear it. And some kids were timing their army games around these explosions. And also, do you remember we had supersonic booms? Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in 1947. 800 miles an hour, this jet. It broke the sound barrier. And they called that a parsec. Oh, no, wait, the parsec's from the Kessler run. That's called a Mach 1, to reach that speed and break the sound barrier. So we got to hear those great noises above us, and everything was around us. It was great to have all that. If you had a pair of clodhoppers, which nowadays they call them hiking boots, you could do anything. You could jump off of rocks. You could just do anything in clodhoppers. And we would put on our clodhoppers in the wintertime. We'd put our Town Talk bread bags and our socks, and then our clodhoppers. We'd put on these cheap plastic green army helmets and climb up the hillside to throw rocks at these massive icicles. And those icicles accumulate these days, and we would just throw rocks and jump out of the way. I don't know why my mother was so worried about these things. Well, my dad signed me up for minor league. I had no interest in to go into baseball, but my brother and I had to go to minor league baseball, and I stunk. I was really bad at it. They put me in far left field. No kid is hitting a ball that far, and I'm out there counting daisies, not paying attention and hoping to see some dust devils blowing by. And so when we walked there, we would take Middle Street from 13th Street. We'd take Middle Street up to 19th Street to go to the, was it called the Kennedy Memorial Field at that time? We just called it Memorial Field. And we'd walk up that way, but soon we took a different route. We walked up South Canal, past the brewery, not the brewery, the brewery. And on the left, before they built those houses, like about 17th and 18th Street, by the railroad tracks, there was like a marsh there with cattails and frogs and tadpoles and snakes. I arrived. My baseball career was over right there. So I'd send my brother, my younger brother, Tom, who showed up tonight, I'd send him to baseball practice, and I'd be there playing, and he came, met me on the way back, and would walk home together. And my mother would ask me why I'm so dirty. And I stole a lot of bases and slid home, and slid to home. So I would lie like that. So, of course, Boy Scouts in Guyasuta just made my life pleasurable, and there's a zillion stories to tell. That's why I'm trying to keep it in this time frame. But I remember sitting over at the middle school, 1330, right there, the elementary school, looking out the window, those massive windows that the teachers had to pull open and close with sticks. Sitting out there watching autumn, watching these leaves blow, and watching these trees bending, and I knew it meant one thing: buckeyes. I knew that the trees were raining buckeyes, and I just had to go out there and get them, as many as I could. So at nighttime, I remember a lot of summer nights, we would play release. Remember the game Release? Yeah, and you catch a bunch of people that have to be there at the stop sign, and that's where their base was, but someone can come release them. Someone runs in, release, and everybody just runs. But I had to be home when the street lights came up. So there were times when I'd be home sweating on the third floor, trying to sleep in the summertime, and I'd hear, release! And I'm like, oh, I could be out there, but I wasn't allowed to be out there that night. So junior high came along, and I was a little too old to be a Boy Scout. So I had to make a decision. And there was two reasons, there were two smells actually, why would make a guy quit Boy Scouts. It's the smell of perfume or gasoline. And so I moved on to junior high school, and then high school was a lot of fun. Well, as much fun as I could have with my father being a district magistrate, but I never got in trouble in his jurisdiction. So, and then when I was out of doors back then, I had a lot of ecology and biology and conservation under my belt, and really enjoyed what I saw out of doors. I just loved to be out there. Well, after I graduated high school, my cousin, Chris Charney, who was just here, Chris Vecchio, she introduced me to Miss Fry. Chris knew my vibe. She knew that I liked all this nature stuff. So she introduced me to Miss Fry, and what a person she was. She had the whole auditorium of the Middle Street School. She had all this great environmental education projects and such on the stage, up the aisles, and on every chair. And my job was to put butterfly collections together and sort out arrowhead collections and work with fossils. When they blew up 28, we would go up there looking for fossils. We were hoping to find dinosaur bones. So I was working for Miss Fry, and also I got to drive the bookmobile to the elementary schools. And we outfitted the bookmobile for environmental education. So it wasn't just a bunch of books. There were study skins and plants, and it was a great job. And Miss Fry, she asked me to be a counselor, a camp counselor, for the Camp Lutherland. And I stayed on for 5 years at Camp Lutherland. And at one time, over here at the middle school, the 3 boys came in with a shoebox with a lid on, and they went to her desk. And she said, "What do you have, boys?" And they said, "We found a dead pigeon." She goes, "Oh, how did it die?" "It got hit by a BB." And she says, "Who shot it?" And these boys, they weren't ready for that question. I mean, that woman was so smart, she was way ahead. There's one other, I have a lot of Camp Lutheran stories. I'm planning to do a whole show about Camp Lutheran. But there was Miss Fry, she knew everything. And just when you thought you knew something, she'd tell you more. So as a camp counselor, the kids were off site. The counselors stayed on a Friday night because we had a seminar at Slippery Rock we had to go to. And she says, "Now, you guys, you need a good rest because it's going to be a long seminar." So we went out all night running around the woods, trying to call owls, running through the cornfields, looking for phosphorescent fungus, and looking at the constellations. So that morning, we all made breakfast, and I'm hovering over a cup of black coffee, Miss Fry said, "So what did you do last night?" I said, "Oh, Miss Fry, I watched Orion rise above the zenith." She said, "Orion doesn't rise until 2:26 a.m." But she was that kind of a woman. She just knew everything and made you feel really special for what you knew. There are times, though, I swear, there are times as an adult I would be trying to doze off, and somewhere in the night I just hear us, "Release!" Thank you.
Thanks. So my family has a strong connection to H.J. Heinz. So that's where my parents met, working at the North Shore factory. But I only recently realized that H.J. Heinz started here in Sharpsburg. I don't know how I didn't know that. But among Allison Babushi's various connections to Sharpsburg is that she has a great-grandmother who worked in that early Heinz plant here. Allison K. Babushi is a Pittsburgh-born artist, teacher, professional storyteller, and arts education consultant. And as a storyteller, she's performed for children and adults in museums, in independent bookstores, schools, libraries, theaters, and festivals from Pittsburgh to New York City, often accompanied by her original puppets. Allison has over 30 years of teaching experience in public, private, and charter school settings, as well as universities and museums. She currently serves as the youth coordinator at the Sharpsburg Community Library. Allison creates art in a variety of media, usually involving textiles and stories. I've known Allison for a long, long time, and she never disappoints with her stories. I'm so excited to have her here. And tonight she's going to tell us about her family connections to this community. And so I'm so happy to introduce Allison Babushi. Please give her a moment.
Okay, you see I'm bringing some stuff here, right? I have a bin of stuff because art teachers don't throw anything away. We keep things. The other reason I have some stuff is because everybody's dead and I just have the stuff. And I know that's grim, but it's really true. My parents died very young, and my grandparents are gone, my great aunts, my uncles. I really only have one blood relative that I know of left here in Pittsburgh. But something comes of being the one to clean out all those houses and find all of those sort of mementos, right, of a lifetime. So I have some of those mementos to move my stories along tonight. And first, a picture of Bata, my great-grandmother, who was the Heinz worker. We're just going to put her right up there for her to listen to us tonight. Now, you know that us storytellers like hyperbole, right? Like a little bit of embellishment or fabrication, maybe, now and again. I say this because some of the stories I heard growing up, I now realize might have had a little bit of that sort of extra sauce mixed in. For instance, when I was researching further for tonight, I realized it is mathematically impossible. My great-grandmother could not have worked, I don't think, at the original Heinz factory in Sharpsburg. But fear not, I have cred. Just wait, you're going to hear about it, okay? So my great-grandmother, Katarzyna Grabowski, and my great-grandfather, Bolesław Grabowski, came from Poland to Pittsburgh in 1930. I knew them as Bata and Judgy, and he was a chipper on the railroad. Does anyone know what a chipper is? I had to look it up. When you are welding the seams on the railroads, the chippers are literally getting rid of the scraps, the little chips like along the edges. Sounds like hard work to me. And Bata, well, she was a pickle bottler. And she was a pickle bottler at the original Heinz factory. And when I was cleaning out my grandmother's house, one of the first mementos I took notice of was this. This was Bata's charm bracelet. And when I started to examine it a little more closely, they are all of the charms that commemorate her years with Heinz. So the very first one has her name engraved. Now, I think most everybody here in Pittsburgh called her Catherine, and my middle name is after hers, but it says Katarzyna here on the medal. And this was for the first 10 years at Heinz. For 15, they gave her this itty-bitty little cute bottle of ketchup, okay? That also has her initials on it and the number 15. It's not till 20 that you would get a small replica of the original Heinz house that was here in Sharpsburg. And finally, 25, the golden pickle. The pickle that we're all familiar with from those little green pickle pins that we had when we were little, right? So this is my proof that she was a pickle bottler here in Sharpsburg, and I used to hear such great stories about Heinz. She always spoke very fondly, the whole family spoke very fondly about the company. For instance, I always heard that they gave them free manicures every week. I thought, well, that's so sweet. Now think about it, they had an ulterior motive. They were putting their hands in the bottles with the pickles, bottling the pickles. But instead of saying, keep your hands clean, they gave them free manicures every week so that they had nice, fresh hands. I also remember hearing about Heinz picnics. And I have a photo of, this is before Nerf spray guns, right? So it's my father and my grandfather with bottles of water, just pouring bottles of water on each other. But if it's hot enough outside, I think that's a fun game. So I remember hearing about a Heinz summer picnic every year that the whole family was invited to. I do believe there was also a place, I think in the Laurel Highlands, where there were cabins. And if you were a Heinz employee, every single Heinz employee, was my understanding, from the bottom to the top, got a weekend with their family at this kind of stay away, kind of cabin park. So it was all of these sort of sweet perks that kept her, I think, at Sharpsburg at Heinz from 1934 to 1959. Now, it is possible she did spend some time here in Sharpsburg because I understand in 1904, we all know that they floated the original Heinz house on a barge. If you didn't know that, imagine the sight. They floated it down the river to sit it with the rest of the Heinz factory on the North Shore. But the glass bottling plant remained here in Sharpsburg. So maybe there were some pickles bottled there. I'm not sure. Maybe she mostly worked on the north side. But I heard about Heinz and the H.J. Heinz Company my whole life, and that was my first sort of introduction to Sharpsburg. Now, sadly, Butta got dementia, and she, just a few years, I only knew her for a few years before she passed, but I remember hearing about a terrible night when my grandmother woke in the middle of the night to find Butta was missing. And nobody had any idea where she was. And it was the wee small hours of the night, and they didn't know what to do, and everybody was up and fretting until there was a knock on the door. Well, where do you think Butta was going? Yeah, absolutely. They found her walking across the bridge on her way to go bottle some pickles. It was time to bottle some pickles. So she was speaking Polish when they found her, so the police took her back to Holy Family Church in Lawrenceville, which was the Polish parish at that time, and thankfully somebody there recognized her and brought her home to my grandmother, Wanda. So she was found. Now, this is my Polish grandmother, Wanda Grabowski, who, and I understand it was very controversial, married an Italian man. She married Roger Babushi, and my great-grandparents lived with them for a time in one of the 3 homes that they owned in Lawrenceville. And our family still has one of them. I just sold one of them. And the 3rd one, they lived in the back of a Polish social hall, which must have been a good time, right? But back to Nan and Pap-Pap. So after Butta passed, I knew the little house in Lawrenceville as my Nan and Pap-Pap's house. And funny thing about my Nan, I called her Big Nan. People would meet her and they would seem disappointed because she was only 5'2". But my little Nan was 4'10". So to me, she was a very big Nan, but she was really quite diminutive. Now, of course, as I mentioned, it was a little bit of a scandal when she married this Italian man, Roger Babushi, but it was he who had the connections to Sharpsburg. So his parents, Francesco Babushi, also known as Frank Babish, after coming here and Americanizing the name, lived here in Sharpsburg with his wife Esther. Unfortunately, there was a rift. There was a fight in the family, as there often is in families. And so for the first probably 20-some years of my life, I did not know any of my Sharpsburg family. My pap did not speak to his brother who lived here in Sharpsburg, and all I knew was some lore, some stories that were sort of in the family. For instance, I was told that I had an Italian great aunt who lived here in Sharpsburg who knew how to put the maluk on you, or she could take the maluk off. So she seemed like a handy friend to have. And I remember once being told that when my my dad was very, very sick, they took his pajamas over to her, and she did some sort of magical incantations to sort of help him out. So there was this sort of mystique about Sharpsburg for me. Now, when I was about 7 or 8, I was finally asked to be in a family wedding. I got to be a flower girl in my cousin Esther's, maybe second cousin Esther's wedding. Well, this was a lot of fun because I was meeting all of this Italian family for the very first time, and I really didn't know them well. So after Esther's wedding, some of us sort of tried to stay in touch. My dad was pretty good at trying to reach out to everybody, so we had one family reunion. Just one. That's all I remember. But we went down to Myrtle Beach, and it turns out there were a whole lot of Babushis, Domians, and Shalabas that I was related to, and they had all moved down to Myrtle Beach because golf, right? So they were down there in Myrtle Beach, and at that family reunion, I got to know these folks as an adult myself. I was in my 20s, okay, so almost an adult. But that was sort of my first time really feeling like I was getting to hang out with that side of the family on my own. Now, even though my pap did not speak to the Sharpsburg family, he worked here in Sharpsburg. I don't know if anyone remembers the Harmony Short Line. The Harmony Short Line was the bus that went from here out to the New Kensington, and he was a bus driver, which I continue to credit with my great ability to parallel park very well. I think it's in the genes, right? If your pap drives a bus, then you can drive a car pretty well. So he drove the bus for the Harmony Short Line, and when the Harmony Short Line was ended, he bought several of the buses and started Rogers Transit, and he had his own bus company. And after a while, Rogers Transit was bought by Port Authority, and he continued as a bus driver for Port Authority. At which time, I was living in Highland Park, and he had the bus route that went right up the end of my street, so that if I timed it just right, I could run out my front door and look sort of around the corner and see his bus go up the street, and I thought that was very exciting. So now, after work, after driving the buses, time was over, you could find him at one place. I don't know how old this shirt is, but these are wool felt. And I tried it on, but it was a little scandalous. I thought it would be a bit much. So here's the Regina Alina shirt that is, I don't know how old. And here is the Regina Alina Beneficial Association handbook from 1979. That's the one that I found in the house. So many of you are probably familiar with the RE. I looked it up. It has been around since 1902. Yeah. So Pap was at the RE, like whenever you didn't know where Pap was, you could bet he was at the RE. That's where he was. He's listed as one of the trustees in the back of this particular handbook, and I know he spent a lot of time there. Now again, to me, I wasn't allowed to go into the RE for many, many years, so it just was like this mysterious place to me where people played pinochle, and I didn't even know what that was, and you would go have your drinks after you're done golfing. Now, I know this is not politically correct. Remember, it was a different time. But my pap would speak of his golfing and RE friends, and it was a whole crew that I would hear about again and again. John the Baker, Benny the Jew, and Sam and Fanny. That's how he always referred to these men. And Sam and Fanny, he talked about all the time. I thought, he spends a lot of time with these two guys, Sam and Fanny. I wonder what their story is. Well, my pap also had one of these, and I loved playing with this thing when I was little. It is an address book right? And you would move this little pointer down to the letter, and then, so one day, as a slightly older girl, I'm opening it up and I'm reading it, and there's Sam Infante, Enfante. He was just one guy, yeah. He was just one guy, but for about 20 years, I thought it was like these two buddies, Sam and Fanny, and they were always together. Not the case, I found out later. So his crew, he would be hanging at the RE with them, and we would gather at the Lawrenceville house for Sunday dinner every Sunday. But whether dinner was ready or not, if Pap wasn't home from the RE, you didn't eat. It wasn't time to eat. Now, as a young girl, sometimes I was quite hungry and quite impatient. So I developed what I thought was magic, and I would go out onto the front porch, and every time say it the same way. I would say, Pap, where are you? And he showed up enough times that I really believed I could just beckon him from the Regina Alina right to my grandmother's house so that we could start eating dinner. Now, I did get to go into the RE finally. For my dad's second wedding, the reception was at the RE. And do you know what I remember? They had just installed a perfume dispenser where you could put money in and get a squirt of perfume. Revlon's Ginette, okay, was at the height of its fame. And so I remember spending the entire night begging grown-ups for money so we could go into the bathroom and douse ourselves with Ginette. So to me, again, what a glamorous place, the Regina Alina. I mean, you can get all of this perfume. So now, as I say, I only knew this sort of little snippets of Sharpsburg when I was younger. But let's fast forward to 2008 or so. One of my friends moved here with her husband, and she walked her dog in St. Mary's Cemetery every day. And finally, one day, she called me and she said, Allison, are these your babushis? And I said, oh, I mean, I guess they must be. But I had never made that journey up the hill to sort of trace who's up there. So Frank and Esther are up there, and I have gone up to visit them many, many, many times. And these roots that I have here in Sharpsburg, perhaps, is what drew me back here. Because it was when I was an adult, I actually was telling stories at Cooper Siegel Library, where Cameron works, and I had told stories there for, honestly, probably 15 years, when someone reached out to me and said, you know, the Sharpsburg Library is hiring a youth coordinator. You should go check it out. And something in my head said, ding, ding, Regina Alina, Sharpsburg, St. Mary's Cemetery, right? And I thought, okay, that would be cool. That would be really cool to go back to this town where I know I had these roots and I have these positive memories. So you can find me at the Sharpsburg Community Library 2 to 3 days a week. You can come take an art class with me. We have art classes for grown-ups. Some of my students are here tonight. They can tell you how much fun we have. But we have the sweetest little library over there, and that is where I did a little more of the research for tonight and learned some of the other facts that go along with these stories. And I appreciate you indulging me tonight to hear just these little snippets of my family and our Sharpsburg roots. Thank you so much.
She's a gift, really. Thank you, Allison. I'm from a mixed marriage. My Polish relatives called us spaghetti benders. Oh, here come the spaghetti benders. I could really relate to that part of the story. Now for something a little bit different. I invited Claire Beams to take the mic tonight because she has written a fictional story that is so close to Sharpsburg that, you know, maybe it's really set here. There are lots of stories that you can read about Paris or Rome, New York City, San Francisco, but here's a story that feels just like Sharpsburg. And it especially fits with Allison's story of her grandma, the pickle packer. Claire is the author of the story collection, We Show What We Have Learned, and the novel, The Illness Lesson. Her new novel, The Garden, will be published by Doubleday in 2024. She's only been in, really. She's only been in Pittsburgh for about 10 years, but her grandmother and great-grandmother both grew up here. She lives in Edgewood with her husband and her 2 daughters and teaches for the Randolph MFA program in Lynchburg, Virginia. And she's going to be reading an excerpt from her story, Lidded. A brilliant writer. Please welcome Claire Beams.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much to Joanne for having me, and it's really just such a pleasure to be here reading with all of you. This is going to feel a little different and a little darker. So this is the ending, yes, of a short story called Lidded, and it is set in early industrial Pittsburgh, so sort of early 1900s. And since I'm starting in the middle, what you need to know, and I made all of this up, this is fiction. This never really happened to my knowledge, and let's hope not. So since I'm starting in the middle, what you do need to know is that our main character, Alice, is a teenage jar labeler at Mr. H's pickle factory, which is, over the course of the story, being photographed for a newspaper article about his impressive modern facility. Just before where I am going to start, Alice found a ring in a jar of pickles and failed to report it. So, also at this time, and this is something that probably many of you already know, but the smog here was in real life so bad that sometimes they would have to turn the street lights on in the middle of the day. And so Mr. H in the story has recently installed fancy electric lights in his courtyard, which is part of the occasion for this big newspaper article about his factory, where everything is meant to be clean and bright and managed. Okay, so we're kind of most of the way through the story at this point. As she passed through Mr. H's courtyard with Frida in the morning, the light felt harsh in Alice's eyes. She wondered how long a ring might stay in a body. She'd seen something in the newspaper once about fish dredged out of one of their rivers and how they turned out to have stomachs stuffed with rusting bolts, coins, ragged scraps of rubber, buttons. There'd been a photograph of a sliced open fish with the river's detritus spread below it like a cache of eggs. The fish had been carrying the burnt-out seeds of their city around with it most of its life. The photograph was why she remembered that fish. Photographs did that, fixed a thing. They sat down at their stations. The photographer was back for more today, working the other side of the room, though surely he had enough pictures of the labelers by now. Alice watched him. She lifted from the right, peeled the label, affixed it, slid left. Right, label, left. Right, label, left. The streetlights stung through the windows. Right, label, left, and stop. Again, something that shouldn't be inside this jar was nonetheless inside it. This time, a swirl of white fabric floating and curling around and shrouding one of the pickles. Alice held the glass tightly and turned. It was a handkerchief. Some girl's handkerchief tucked up her sleeve probably before it had dropped somehow into the brine. How boneless the handkerchief looked, twisting there fleshily. The sight of it made Alice's stomach clench tight. "Frida," she showed her. Frida flinched. Alice pushed her bench back. It scraped the floor and turned all heads, even the photographer's, but she didn't stop, just headed for the floor supervisor. Alice held out the jar. "Look at this," she said. The woman's face woke up. She took the jar from her to twist it the way Alice had. There was something there yesterday, too, Alice almost said, but then this woman would ask her, "Why didn't you bring it to me?" "All right, you go on back to your station," the floor supervisor told her, and left the floor with the jar. "What did she say?" Frida asked when Alice sat down again. "Nothing, she just took it." A weight began to lift now that Alice had done what she should have done the first time. Maybe this rightness now somehow made up for the wrongness then. Right, label, left, and all the pickles were just pickles inside their jars, friendly, bumpy green, nothing bobbing or drifting in their midst. The floor supervisor would take that jar where it needed to go. A mistake. Even Mr. H's factory could make a mistake, but now he would unmake it. So the handkerchief would not tangle wetly in even the most careless person's mouth, throat, because the jar with the handkerchief in it would never find its way to anyone. Now that they knew about the handkerchief, they'd set about understanding how it had happened, what had gone wrong with all their inspections, and maybe they'd find the jar with the ring in it without needing to be told. Maybe Alice had said enough, even if she hadn't said everything. "Come with me, miss." Alice looked up. The floor supervisor was standing over her. Alice hadn't seen or heard her coming at all. "What?" Alice said, meaning, "What are you doing here?" In her mind, the floor supervisor had been miles away by now, making everything safe again. "Mr. H wants to see you," the floor supervisor said. Alice wanted to catch at Frida's hand the way you'd catch hold of a shipmate if you were going overboard, but Frida kept her face so blank there was no finger hold to find. Alice stood and followed the floor supervisor from the room. They walked in silence to the shiny elevator. With a muted ding, the doors opened on the lush red landscape of the top floor restaurant, empty except for Mr. H, over at a window table with a teacup in his hands. The floor supervisor brought Alice across that thick, hushing carpet like crossing a sea. "Miss Lund!" Mr. H rose to greet her, to Alice's disbelief. He knew her name. His smile was obviously valuable. You would pay to have it on you. "Please, have a seat. Join me," he said, and waved a hand. An alertness like joy ran across Alice's shoulders into her fingertips. "Have some tea." He poured some into her cup, but if she lifted that cup, Alice knew it would shake and he would see. Mr. H looked at her hands, and she wondered if he could see them shaking anyway. "I hear you've had quite a morning," he said. Alice didn't know what to say. She just smiled back at him so it would be clear that she wasn't complaining, that she was fine with it, with the morning she'd had. "I wanted to let you know personally that it's all been resolved now." "Oh, good, that's good." "Yes, it turned out to be nothing." Alice nodded her head agreeably, but she expected him to keep talking, keep explaining. "Nothing?" she said finally. "Nothing at all." "But what do you mean? I saw a handkerchief." He held up a finger. "You thought you saw a handkerchief." Alice shook her head now. "I did. I saw one. I can see how it might have looked that way, but it turned out there was nothing there." "I don't understand." "That's all right." He sipped his tea and regarded her pleasantly. "You don't need to understand anything because it was nothing. Now, Miss Lund, I have something for you to lift your mood after this morning." Mr. H pushed a plush velvet box across the table. Alice opened it. A silver hair comb shone inside, real silver, judging by its density when she weighed it in her palm, shaped into a decorative seashell at the top. Below, the long, straight teeth, sharp and gleaming. Mr. H put his cup down with a gentle clink that she could tell signaled like a punctuation mark the end of this sentence of his day. "I'll let you get back to work now, Miss Lund." He extended a hand into all the space she should use to walk out of the room. Alice slid the box with the comb into her pocket. On her way out at the end of the day, Alice hung close to the floor supervisor and pulled short for a second as she passed her. "You saw it?" "I saw what Mr. H says I saw." The floor supervisor met Alice's eyes. "So did you." "I don't have to look," Alice told herself at her bench in the morning. Her hands knew what to do without her eyes. They were strong as they felt, even if they were dirtied by what they had done, and they performed their tasks without the need of sight at all. She tried staring at the door at the end of the room, the way you were supposed to stare at the horizon if you felt seasick. Alice did, in a way. She'd left the comb at home, buried beneath the clothes at the bottom of her drawer. It seemed to belong in the dark, like a shell dredged from the deepest part of the ocean, the part so deep light never reached there. Alice watched the photographer circling. Today was his last day at the H factory. The light was the same as yesterday's light out the windows. Alice could look out the windows. Alice could look everywhere but at the jars. No rules, not even in Mr. H's rule-filled factory, about where a person had to look. A crash, the sharp to splashing sound of a glass object full of liquid breaking. Frida grimaced. My dumb elbow knocked it right off. The cleaning girl was already hurrying in their direction with her mop and bucket. So it was Frida's fault, really, that Alice forgot herself enough to glance down again at the jar she was about to lift from its shelf, which was fine, that one was fine, but in the one beside it she saw curled amongst the pickles within, pickled and ragged and fishy, whitest white, the tip, just the tip of a finger. Which finger? It was hard to tell without the context of the rest of the hand. The finger was bent a little at its one joint, very ashen, bleached of its color, drained of its blood, very neat of nail, too. What were they partitioning out here, jar by jar? This whole seamless system for housing and sealing, all these tidy, identical finished containers, what was inside? This factory might be chewing up girl after girl, bit by bit, and spitting them out again. Disaster of any size might fit into these pickles and relishes and sauces if severed, trimmed, ground down enough. The wreckage of any sea. It wasn't fair to make a person see and then make her see this. Alice rose. Bearing the jar in front of her, she cut a path straight to the photographer. He lowered the camera's silver eye. Miss? Alice held the jar up to the light, the abundant, strong, false light coming in through the window. The jar flooded with it like a green bulb, the finger floating central as a filament. Take the picture, Alice said, and held it closer to be sure he could see well enough to make the camera see in turn. She rotated the jar back and forth, and the finger pointed now this way, now that, this, that, while the camera flashed and caught. And in every one of the pictures was Alice, making herself cleaner and cleaner with every frame. Alice holding the jar in one hand, pointing at the bobbing finger with her own still one. There, you see? You see. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. I love to end on a gruesome note. She's a nice person. She's a mom. We're going to take a break now. A few notes before that. We have food and drink in this next room, and then we have more speakers after our break. Marcia will be there with her books, or all kinds of interesting stuff in the next room. And right over here on this table, there are prompts. So for writers, they are accustomed to this, but I'll explain. It's a little sentence that you can complete, and the sentence is, here's what I love about Sharpsburg. If you'd like to write what you love about Sharpsburg on a little slip of paper and put it in the jar, I will read those at the very end. You don't even have to identify yourself. You can say any outrageous thing you want. So we'll just take like a little 10, 15-minute break and then come back. We start the second half with Robert Gallo. See you soon.